She stood in the center of the town hall with her hands clenched so tightly that her nails cut into her palms. Yet she felt nothing because shame, when it's loud enough, numbs everything else. The accusation had spread faster than the prairie wind, faster than truth ever could. And by the time she was called to explain herself, the verdict had already been written in the narrowed eyes of neighbors she once trusted. They said she lied about the missing land deed, lied about the threats, lied about the night she ran barefoot through the fields, to the only ranch whose lights were still on. Her voice trembled as she spoke, not because her story was false, but because every word felt like it was being dragged through thorns before it reached their ears. In the back of the hall sat the rancher, Elias Cole, his hat low, his jaw set, his presence heavy with unspoken weight. Everyone expected him to stand, to confirm her lie, to protect his own peace by siding with the crowd, because silence in a small town was often read as agreement. She looked at him once, just once, hoping for a nod, a word, anything, but he remained still. That silence fell like a final hammer. The elders dismissed her claim. Friends turned their backs. Work disappeared. By sundown she was no longer just a woman accused. She was a warning story, parents whispered to their children. Yet what no one understood was that Elias's silence was not emptiness. It was restraint. He knew the truth better than anyone, because the night she came running, terrified and breathless, she had collapsed on his porch with the deed clutched to her chest, and he had hidden it where no fire or thief could reach. He had seen the bruises on her arms, heard the names she refused to say. But Elias had learned long ago that words, spoken too early, could get people killed, in a town where power wore friendly smiles. So he let them condemn her. He let her leave town with nothing but a suitcase and a reputation in ruins. From the outside, his silence destroyed her world, but beneath it, a different future was being quietly built, one painful day at a time, waiting for the right moment to rise. Years later, the town gathered again, this time not for judgment, but for loss. Fires had taken 3 ranches, records had vanished, and the men who once controlled everything were scrambling to hold on to what remained. That was when she returned, not broken, not begging, but steady, composed, carrying herself like someone who had learned how to survive without approval. Whispers followed her footsteps, but she did not flinch. Elias stood beside the courthouse steps, older now, lines etched deeper into his face. And for the first time he lifted his head and spoke. His voice did not tremble. He produced the deed, the documents, the proof that had been buried by greed and fear. He named names. He told the truth in full, even when it cost him contracts, friendships, and the ranch he had spent his life building. The town finally understood what his silence had been protecting, not lies, but time. Time for her to escape, to rebuild, to return stronger than the version they tried to erase. Apologies came too late, but they came. She did not ask for forgiveness. She asked for justice, and she got it. As the crowd dispersed, she stood beside Elias, the weight of the past finally lifting. His silence had shattered her once, but it had also saved her life, given her space to become someone unbreakable. The world she lost was never meant to keep her small. The world she gained was forged in quiet endurance and one man's refusal to speak until the truth could no longer be destroyed. And long after the town forgot its shame, her story remained, a reminder that silence can be cruelty. But sometimes, in the hands of someone brave enough, it can also be the loudest act of protection there is. The days after the truth came out did not bring peace as quickly as the town expected. Instead, they brought a strange, aching quiet that felt heavier than the lies ever had, because now everyone had to live with what they had done, while she had already learned how to live without them. She stayed in the old boarding house at the edge of town, the same place she had once cleaned floors in exchange for a room, and each morning she walked the familiar streets with a calm that unsettled people more than anger ever could. Some avoided her eyes, others tried to speak and failed, but she moved through them like weather, present, undeniable, no longer asking permission to exist. Elias watched from a distance at first, not because he feared her resentment, but because he understood that silence still had a role to play even now. It gave her space to decide what the truth would mean on her own terms. The court proceedings dragged on. Names were recorded, properties frozen, and the men who once laughed together on porches now sat alone, waiting for judgments that could not be softened by charm. Through it all, she was called to testify again and again, and each time her voice grew steadier, not louder because she no longer needed to convince anyone of anything. Facts. Did that work for her now? At night, she sat by the window and thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived in town, hopeful, trusting, unaware of how easily truth could be buried, and she realized that version of herself was gone, not lost, but transformed, like land after a fire that looks ruined until spring proves otherwise. Elias eventually joined her one evening, sitting across from her with the same careful presence he had always carried. And for the first time, they spoke openly about the cost of his silence and the cost of her survival. Neither trying to outweigh the other, both understanding that some choices saved lives while still leaving scars. He told her he would not ask for forgiveness, because he had learned that forgiveness demanded honesty, not requests. And she told him she had not returned for closure, but for balance, because a world tilted by lies needed something heavier than anger to set it right. When the final rulings came down, the town changed its tone overnight, declaring lessons learned, promising to do better, but she knew real change did not announce itself. It showed up quietly in how power was questioned and how voices were believed before proof became tragedy. On her last day, she stood at the edge of the fields where everything had once unraveled and felt something unexpected, not victory, not bitterness, but a steady sense of ownership over her own story, one no accusation could take from her again. Elias watched her leave with no dramatic farewell, just a nod that carried years of understanding. And as the dust settled behind her, the town was left with the hardest truth of all, that her world had not been changed by their judgment or even by his silence alone, but by her refusal to let either define the end of her life's story. Time moved forward as it always did, but it did so differently for the town than it did for her, because while the town tried to rewrite its memory into something more forgiving, she carried the past not as a wound, but as a compass, guiding every choice she made beyond its borders. She settled far away where no one knew her name, building a life with deliberate care, choosing work that depended on integrity rather than reputation, surrounding herself with people who asked questions before forming judgments. And slowly, almost without noticing, she stopped waking in the night with the old fear tightening her chest. Yet the story followed her in quiet ways, letters from women she had never met, stories whispered through legal channels and advocacy groups, cases that sounded painfully familiar, and she realized that what had happened to her was not an isolated cruelty, but a pattern that thrived wherever silence was misunderstood and truth demanded too high a price. So she began to speak, not with anger, not with spectacle, but with precision, telling her story in courtrooms, in small meetings, in places where a single voice could change how decisions were made. And each time she spoke, the weight that once crushed her seemed to lift a little more, redistributed into purpose. Back in the town she had left behind, Elias remained not as a hero, not as a martyr, but as a man reshaped by consequence. He rebuilt what he could with fewer allies and more honesty, refusing shortcuts, refusing quiet deals, knowing that the cost of his silence had been measured and paid, and that from now on his words would have to arrive exactly when they were needed. Years later, when they crossed paths again by chance rather than fate, there was no dramatic reunion. Only mutual recognition of survival earned the hard way, and in that brief meeting, they understood something neither had fully grasped before, that the silence which once changed her world forever had also changed his, stripping away illusion and leaving behind responsibility. As they parted, there was no promise to stay in touch, no attempt to reclaim what might have been, because both knew that their connection was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be pivotal, a single intersection, where one person's restraint and another's endurance altered the direction of two lives. And long after their footprints faded from that moment, the truth remained where lies once stood unchallenged, not as a monument but as a standard, reminding anyone willing to listen that a world can be broken by accusation, reshaped by silence, and ultimately rebuilt only when the courage, quiet or spoken, refuses to let injustice be the final word.